So I've had this problem since I began working on this project. A lot of people are interested in Sochi now, and when I start to talk about what I've been working on, I can't stop. And my big problem today was trying to narrow down what I was going to talk about. So what I've tried to do is, in the beginning, give you a general overview of Sochi as it existed during the Soviet period and the whole idea of the Soviet health resort system. Then go a little bit more into one of the areas that I focused on in my research, and then at the end, maybe open it up again to some questions that I'm still thinking about. So, without further ado, you're probably hearing a lot about Sochi these days. It's, as you know, going to be the site of the Winter Olympics in February 2014. Now, if you look at the images that I'm going to show you, you'll recognize not exactly a winter sport theme. Sochi is known in Russia, for Russians, it's a very popular resort. It's kind of like an equivalent to, I don't know, Las Vegas in a way, although it's, as you'll see, very, very different. But in terms of people's experience, familiarity with the city, most people have been there at some point. Their parents have been there. Everyone has a kind of family history related to Sochi, and they know it as basically a summer resort, a tropical area that has palm trees, it's warm, it's a seaside city. You can see the theme here. And if you pay attention to the images here, you'll also note the typical architecture of this city. So neoclassical buildings. These are all sanatoria that you see here. In the lower left-hand corner, you see Matsesta, which is their source for the mineral waters that people used for bathing and drinking to take the cure, the water cure. But then the other buildings are various sanatoria. There were over 50 in the city, and they were typically associated with trade unions. And the wonderful thing about this was if you worked in the Soviet Union, you actually had the right to a vacation. So you got 3 weeks, usually, vacation. And many times your trade union would actually pay for you to go to a health resort. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. Another postcard here. What it says there in the Russian, the best health resorts for the best people of the Soviet Union. So the idea was if you worked hard, the Soviet Union gave back to you in the form of a health vacation. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that. This idea of a socialist city, a socialist resort, plays out in a number of ways. So this is actually the day in which one of the most famous sanatoria, the Ordzhonikidze Sanatorium, was open to the public. And this is the collective of people who built the sanatorium, and it's the opening, but it's in Russian, they call it zdachi, the giving away or the giving of the buildings, the grounds, to the public. And you can see, this is a little bit later image, this very relaxed style that was typical of the sanatoria. And this is actually, you may not be able to read it. If you can, you'll see there at the bottom it says, the sanatoria and health resorts of the USSR are run solely for the convenience and benefit for the recuperation, rest, and recreation of the nation's workers. And this, again, is just an image that gives you a sense of the feel, what that was like. And then this is what's going on today in Sochi. So one of the aspects of my project is actually describing the tremendous changes that are taking place there. I had gone to Sochi in 1989 as a student studying Russian. That was one of the last years of the Soviet period. And then in 2009, I decided to go back. And I found the place completely different. And moreover, in the middle of this vast transformation that's been taking place over the past, I would say, 7 years. It really started in about 2007 Part of it is related to the anticipation of getting the Olympics. They hadn't actually acquired the games at that point, but they were making a bid. But also just the idea of having a resort for, I would say, the new Russians, for the wealthy, the new business people who were making a lot of money and were tending to take vacations abroad. Sochi has always been singled out as the warmest place, the most hospitable place in a very cold country. And so now there's this remaking of the city to try to appeal to this new type of Soviet vacationer. And so as you can see, one of the things that I'm documenting is the building of these high-rises, which have dramatically changed the way the city looks and feels. I was just there for a couple of weeks in September, and because of all this construction, because of the preparation for the Olympics, the place is just a mess right now. The streets are clogged. You get in a car and you just sit, even if you're driving on one of the main thoroughfares. The sidewalks are all torn up, so it's really difficult even just to get around in Sochi right now. So a place that was known for, as a place you would get away to and relax and rest, has become a very hectic and strenuous place to be. Now, the title of the talk, Olympic Minds, Bodies, and Souls, actually refers to the Soviet idea for the city. Their notion, as you can see by this, this is a statue that was in front of the Ordzhonikidze Sanatorium, was to build this new Soviet man, this new Soviet woman, according to the new ideals of the socialist state. So this was not just a place to physically recuperate, but the idea of the Soviet vacation was very much one of what they called an active rest. And the process was, they often use this word complex cure, complex treatment. So you came there and you got physical attention, medical attention, but there was also a great deal of attention paid to cultural programming and this sort of thing. So I was teaching Plato's Republic last year and was reading the third book. There were several passages there that really reminded me of the idea behind the Soviet sanatorium. So a good soul, by means of its own virtue, makes the body as good as possible. So this interrelation, this holistic notion of health, that it's not just the body, the physical body that you're concerned with, but it's mental health, it's political education as well. Again, this is from Plato's Republic. What about needing the craft of medicine for something besides wounds or some seasonal illnesses? What about needing it because idleness and the regimen we described have filled one full of gases and phlegm, like a stagnant swamp, so that sophisticated doctors are compelled to come up with names like flatulence and catarrh to describe one's diseases? In fact, again, this corresponds very much to what the Soviets had in mind for these sanatoria. So there was a great deal of prophylactic care. The idea was not to send someone there who was having some sort of acute illness, but actually to send people there in the normal course of events to treat whatever complaints they might have and to try to set them on the course for a better way of life. And when I've gone back and looked at this, actually, the Roman baths had some of these same ideas in place. So you went to take a bath, and there would be a library there. There would be sometimes public lectures given, reading rooms, athletic fields, this sort of thing. So it was a very holistic idea back then. Over time, as this went forward, it became much more of an aristocratic tradition in Europe. This is from a French bath. And it was something that was generally, you needed to be wealthy to be able to afford to go to one of these institutions. And that was really the case in Russia as well. They didn't have the long tradition of baths in Russia or mineral water treatments, hot spring treatments. But when Peter the Great visited Europe, he decided that this was a good thing and ordered the exploration of Russia to find sources for healing waters. And this was really the beginning of the development of spas in Russia. But by the early 20th century, this was very much something that was affordable only to a small minority of Russians. So when the Soviets took over, one of the things that Lenin did, he signed a decree nationalizing all of the health resorts. So what you see here, this is actually a statue outside the theater in Sochi. It looks kind of like Marcus Aurelius or something, but if you pay closer attention, you can see he's holding tools and is wearing shop clothing. So the idea was giving over this institution to the workers and remaking it in their behalf. And there are some very famous instances where this took place. So the Levadia resort, or it's actually the personal resort, dacha you could call it, of the Tsar, was given over to the peasants as a health resort in 1925. And you can see they're celebrating this event there. Mayakovsky even wrote a poem about this, talking about the peasant Sanatorium you see at the bottom. And the poem is called Miracles or Wonders. And here you can see some people relaxing on the grounds of that resort. But the next image shows you something a little bit different. So I've already mentioned this idea that socialist or Soviet rest was not just lying around, in a recliner, but it was important that it be active rest. And this is related to some of the interest in the 1920s in this, what they call the scientific organization of labor. If you're familiar with Taylor, there were these ideas that were very popular at the time in relation to the development of the assembly line. How do we make workers more efficient, more productive? And one of the things they began to think about was this is not just a question of how people behave in the workplace, but it's actually a question of how they behave all the time. So if we want to increase productivity, we could make workers work longer hours, but that's actually a very anti-Soviet approach to that, right? They were trying to shorten the work week. So if we're going to shorten the work week, then we need to make workers more productive when they're at work. If we want them to be more productive, we want them to be well rested. And being well rested doesn't mean going out and drinking with your buddies or gambling or anything like that. They developed this clear idea of what Soviet rest was like. And when people talk about going on vacation, even to this day, this is an idea that really was developed in the Soviet period. We say, I'm going on vacation. Soviets say, I'm taking a rest, or I'm going for a rest. And ottych is the Russian word, became an important concept not only for how you spent your vacation, but how you spent your free time in general. So you see here people doing calisthenics. This is, again, the Ordzhonikidze. I have a lot of images of that sanatorium because I've worked on it a lot. So there was this public education campaign going on. Semashko was the Commissar of Public Health. Here's a pamphlet that he published in 1924. What's a resort, or what are resorts, and how do you take a cure at them, or how do you take treatments in them? Here's another of his pamphlets, How to Rest in Summer. This is a bit later. This is an image again from Ordzhonikidze, and this actually is from Metallurg, another sanatorium. And you note there, I put this image there because you see there are two single beds. So this was not a family vacation. In the early days, they sent you there by yourself. You were supposed to get away from everything that might annoy you or tire you in any way, and really focus on your health. I almost said focus on yourself, but that's not exactly true. You notice that in addition to the single beds, wouldn't it be great to be sleeping next to a total stranger like that on your vacation? That doesn't seem very restful for us. But really the idea, you notice it's a very spare room. There's a radio there, a radio that probably had one channel. They usually just had a volume button. You could just turn it up and down. So you either wanted to hear what they had to say or you didn't. But the idea was you were not supposed to just lie around in your room either. You were supposed to be out doing things. So in addition to all of the medical care that you received, Sochi had a very rich art collection in their museum. They had a summer theater, a winter theater. They had a circus. The people loved the circus in the Soviet Union. They had a full-time building for the circus. It wasn't something that just rolled through town occasionally. All kinds of cultural programming, public lectures, etc. If you note here, this is again from that same sanatorium, Metallurg, so for the metal workers industry. There's a TV. Now that would be the TV that you would have access to. It's not in a room, it's in a common area. And if you notice, none of the chairs are situated facing the TV. And you can see a big portrait of Pushkin there. I think that shows maybe a little bit the priorities. The TV is kind of there, but Pushkin, the great father of Russian literature, is reminding everyone that maybe they should go read a book instead. Your time was also carefully managed, and this may seem a little off-putting to you. This is actually from a pioneer camp, a kids camp. But you can see, it's a little blurry there, but the schedule for the day, it includes meals. For kids, of course, it's a little bit more detailed in ways that maybe it wouldn't be for adults, but telling them when they should bathe, when they should wash their hands, and when they should brush their teeth, and the whole thing is laid out there. And really, something similar was characteristic of the adult experience as well. So you would get up in the morning. Very often they would have group exercises like this here. They're doing them down by the sea, which must have been very pleasant. There's another one. I love this picture. I actually thought about having everyone get up and do some of these exercises. I'm giving a talk at DePaul next week, and I am going to have everyone do that, but I wasn't sure whether I should do it here. Now, look here. This is people lying on deck chairs. What do you notice that's kind of odd about this picture? Everyone's facing the same way. And what else do you notice? A woman in white there. So there's a nurse there walking up and down, telling people when to turn. I've heard in LA on the radio stations, they say it's time to turn so you don't burn. I guess they have a similar thing in LA with the beach culture there. So when you arrived at the sanatorium, you visited with a doctor, and he gave you an examination. You described any kind of health issues you had, and he would give you a very simple health grade, a 1, 2, or a 3. And depending on what grade you got, it determined how long you should spend sunbathing, wind bathing, and water bathing. And they actually had nurses who were paying attention to all this. Now, that may sound, again, a bit overbearing. I think in actuality, the experience was not always so, let's say, the oversight was not always so keen as that sounds. I think you could probably get away with lying on the beach a little longer if you wanted to. Although I do, if we have time at the end, I'll show you a video of a woman who went to a children's camp, and she describes they were all divided into groups, and there would be someone blowing a whistle, and they'd say, okay, group number 1, wolves, into the water, right? And they would all run and play, and then the whistle would blow again, and they would have to get out, and then the group number 2, the foxes, into the water. So it was certainly like that for the kids. And it appears, yes, there. So here's some kids lying out bathing, and there's a nurse there watching, and this I love, right? I don't exactly know the story of this. But I guess they would actually pour water over you just to make sure. These are, of course, children again. You weren't getting overheated. And then if you went for medical therapies, we're going to pay a little bit more attention to this in a few minutes, but I just have this image here. You had all kinds of surprises in store for you. So they would shoot you with a kind of a fire hose there, or they would use a giant mirror to reflect the sun's rays onto your back. It's a concentration of the sun's rays. You might go to Matsesta. This is as I mentioned, the source for the waters in Sochi, and drink mineral waters. They had nurses or medical personnel working in the kitchen. So in addition to your prescription for sun, wind, and water bathing, you actually had a diet prescribed for you, and they would give you the food that was appropriate for your medical needs. You sat down at the table, and they brought you what you should eat. Sometimes a little bit disappointing if you're used to eating the sweets. I remember, actually, that's a story I can tell. I have some slides from when I visited. Well, I'll come back to that when I get to that point. Then here's a lecture. Volleyball, so any kind of group sport was, of course, encouraged. Reading was encouraged. And then the playing of chess. You think about that, right? So if you're going to spend your time playing a game, let it be an edifying game, one that develops your mental capacity, your strategic capabilities. Chess was a huge thing in Russia, but it was especially promoted at the sanatorium. All of them had these big chess tables, like you see here. Right, so this is, it's a little bit small, but you can see there are 2 chess tables there. More chess playing. I pulled these in because they're in English, but those images are from rest homes, which were a slightly different variant than the sanatorium. These were places where you could go. They were tended to be closer to the cities, and you could go for shorter stays. And then dancing in the evening. The dancing was very popular. And so if you think about it, it's social dancing. One problem that occurred over time was that if you went there by yourself, if you weren't there with your family and you were spending the evening dancing with strangers, well, who knows what could happen. This actually, we do know, was a problem. And eventually they began allowing family vacations, in part because of complaints from frustrated or angry wives and husbands over what had taken place. Sorry, that was note to self. So, as the slide said, I actually spent some time at the Ordzhonikidze Sanatorium. I've been at the Metallurg Sanatorium. This is, that's lunch, I believe, lunch. You see the sort of fare. You've got lots of vegetables, meat, a balanced diet, never any dessert. If you wanted dessert, you could take a piece of fruit, which there aren't any. Usually that bowl back there would have some fruit in it. And the interesting thing was, you think that you sort of manage your diet, and I try to eat pretty well, and I think I do a pretty good job of it. But if you stay at a sanatorium and they never give you any sweets, it really starts to get to you after a little while. And I would find myself going out and just buying a milkshake or something, and it really did make me think about that, right? And this was the idea, right? They were effectively training me to think more about what I did, and it started to feel wrong somehow, to eat a candy bar or something like that. This was the idea. Instead of getting a milkshake, why not get an oxygen shake? These are actually popular, I guess, all over Europe right now, but they're supposed to, help oxygenate your blood. Instead of just rambling around the city, why not take a medicinal walk or a therapeutic walk? So they actually had, this is something they did in Germany, Terrenkuri. The Terrenkuri is like a health walk, and if you see, this is the start point, and it would measure out. This was another thing that would be prescribed. So if you were a 1, you were supposed to walk a certain different distance. If you were a 2, a greater distance. A 3, you could go even further. You were supposed to take these medicinal walks or constitutionals. And then the next series of images are from the medical wing at the sanatorium. I'm going to turn my attention a little bit more focus toward the medical treatments now. So I took a tour. They actually did allow me to take some treatments, but because I think back on it now, and I think I kind of, I wish that I had been a little bit more honest about the state of my health. I think I kind of downplayed some of my issues. It would have been interesting to see how they would have treated, a couple of ongoing issues, congestion and this sort of thing. It's just the sort of thing they love to treat. But I didn't get much. You'll see what I got. It's going to pop up here in a minute. But I got massage, oxygen shakes, and a steam treatment. I'll show you an image of that. But they did give me a tour, and there I saw these instructional posters that showed how these treatments worked and how they were to be applied. So galvanization, wouldn't we all like to be galvanized more than we are? Local methods of galvanization. Induction therapy, all various forms of medical electricity. Darsanvalization. Darsanval. Actually, oh shoot, I didn't bring it. You can actually buy a very similar thing if you go on eBay, if you're interested in this, look up violet ray, and you will find these same machines, most of them vintage. There were so many of them, they were so popular that you can literally find hundreds of them on eBay. And some of them still work, some of them don't. I bought one, I was going to bring it in, but it stopped working. I think they're just very temperamental things. I was showing it off one too many times. But what it is, you hold it up to your skin and it shoots out little sparks. And it's hard to say, it's hard to describe the sensation. You know, it's like someone taking a sweater that's full of static electricity and just running it back and forth on your arm. And supposedly it you know, wakes the blood up a little bit and is good for sort of local pains and aches. And then this one is the one that really fascinated me. If you read the description, I promised a demonstration of this, and this machine too has proven temperamental. It's not working right now, so I did not bring it. But if you look, well, you can't quite see it, but I actually bought this very machine because when I stayed at the Orjonikidze Sanatorium, they were about to close it for reconstruction and remodeling. And when I went back the next year, they had sold all the medical equipment. But luckily, the one thing that I had really wanted to acquire, the Franklinization Machine, was still there, and I was able to buy it. So that's how I ended up with one of these. I would love to give you all a treatment someday, but we can't do it today. But as you see, as suggested by the image there, you would sit under it, or you could stand, but I think most people sat. Put your feet on a metal plate, and this shower of electric current bathed you. And it ionized the air and was supposed to have, so we saw some local treatments, this was supposed to have a more global effect. So if you were suffering from neuralgia or even neurasthenia, which was very curious to me, they would give you a treatment with Franklinization. We'll come back to this question of neurasthenia in a minute. Magnet therapy. Group light therapy. Look at that one. I don't know if you can see the picture, but everyone's standing naked in a circle and receiving group light therapy. I think that sounds really grand. And this is another way of administering magnet therapy. So they wheel you into this chamber. They could turn on various magnets depending on where you needed treatment. And this was one of the prized pieces of their medical equipment, as they described it to me. Wax therapy. And of course, all kinds of water therapy. I have tons of images of the various forms of water therapy. And then there I am getting my steam treatment. We'll come back to what that is all about in a minute. But as I said, this Franklinization machine really captured my attention. And when I got back home, I just started thinking about it. Why did that experience of walking through that medical wing, why was I so uncomfortable? Why did it seem so dubious to me? And why did all these treatments that were really, decidedly marginal in our medical system, either considered alternative therapies or perhaps supplemental therapies, why were they so, how did they find their way into the Soviet mainstream? So as I looked into this, this is not just one sanatorium, but these treatments are very typical of what was offered at the sanatorium. And as I began looking into this, I found that all of these treatments had their own heyday in our own medical system in the United States. And in the library in Krivar Science Library, I was able to find stacks, literally rows of these books about these old forms of therapy, rational hydrotherapy. So you notice the author there, Kellogg. We'll come back to him in a minute. But that's the brother of the Kellogg who's made cornflakes, etc. So heat therapy, phototherapy, whether natural or artificial. These are all books in our library. One of the great manuals on the uses of medical electricity. And as I looked through these, a lot of them are really beautifully illustrated. I saw treatments that looked even more strange than what I had seen in the medical wing at the sanatorium. And so I became even more intrigued. And as I mentioned, one of the things that I found that these were used for was the treatment of neurasthenia. Now that also sounded strange to me. I don't think any of us know anyone who's been diagnosed with neurasthenia, although if I described what it is to you, nervous exhaustion, stress that produces irritability, if I really gave you a rundown of the symptoms, we might all kind of put our hands up at least a little bit, right? We might all be slightly neurasthenic. And that's actually one of the problems with it, that it's a very loosely formed diagnosis. And eventually, it was jettisoned from the diagnostic manual in the United States. No one is actually treated for neurasthenia anymore here. But that's not the case in the rest of the world, or in much of the rest of the world. So in Russia, China, they still have this diagnosis, and they still actively treat people for nervous exhaustion. And in fact, though it was called the American disease, as that's a famous qualification that was given to it by George Beard, he thought it was characteristic of American life, this faster pace, lots of new inventions, electrical equipment, motors, everything was speeding up, and urban life was becoming more congested. He thought all of this was just too much for our nerves, and we were all facing this potential to become exhausted by it. And there's Weir Mitchell, another important figure in the history of this. If any of you read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, she actually was prescribed a rest cure by Weir Mitchell, and that book is her description of that experience. So they took different approaches. Beard believed in these kind of invigorating, these therapies that he could administer in his office, and Weir Mitchell believed in rest. And it turns out that in the Soviet Union, this took on a life of its own. So this idea that it's the American disease, but Lenin himself was diagnosed with neurasthenia. This may have been a ruse. He was sick, and they were trying to cover up what was actually going on, and they were calling it neurasthenia. But in fact, if we look closely in the 1920s, there was this idea of Soviet neurasthenia, that there were people who were giving so much of their energy to the revolution. They were so devoted. They were just selfless. They weren't resting. They were becoming exhausted. And so they needed to rest in this very particular way that they developed. And I will actually switch out here from my PowerPoint briefly. I will show you a clip from a movie. Did I go too far? I think I did. Yes. Hopefully this is still going to play. It's silent, so we don't need to worry about sound. This is a movie that came out in the late 20s, and it was called Bolny Nervy. So sick nerves, I guess we would say. And it describes this person who is just classic neurasthenic. He's just working too hard. And you see, look at that treatment. And here's someone getting a Franklinization treatment. Another person, right? It's making their hair raise on their head. So he is actually packed off to a sanatorium. He's told to quit smoking and drinking and all the classic things that they began to practice at all of the sanatoria. They were already working out. Here's taking some relaxing baths. There it is. That's what it was like. And we don't want that. As I mentioned, Lenin himself was diagnosed with neurasthenia. We know of other cases of party officials, overworked. They were told to go off and take a rest. And a lot of writers in the 1920s, Zoshenko, Bulgakov, also talked about this problem of exhausted nerves. And this summer, September, I was able to access some of the medical records from the sanatorium in Sochi. This is a little faint, but I don't know if you can see this number right here, 192. That's actually the number of cases of neurasthenia. And if you look, it's much higher than anything else. So I was able to determine that they were treating a lot of people for neurasthenia. And this next one shows the electrical procedures administered. Now, it's dwarfed by the number of water procedures at this particular sanatorium, but it's still very high. So this is sea bathing, and this is electro procedures. And in other cases, those numbers are even closer. So here, this is again electrical procedures. Anyway, I wasn't sure to what extent this was really true, and I was able to find here again. So the number of sea bathing treatments, 1,858. The number of electro procedures, 1,852. So very high number. And then I will say that over time, the diagnosis of neurasthenia did drop in the Soviet Union, but you can see this is 1977. Well, I will have to help you again with the pointer because it's in Russian, but this right here, you may be able to, if you know a little Greek, you may be able to figure out that's neurasthenia. 336 cases. You know, there's some things that are being diagnosed more often, but it's still clearly a common diagnosis. So I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit and just talk about one of the other things that has proven to be very interesting to me. When I talked about this whole system of treatment having its heyday in the United States, some of you may have heard of the Battle Creek Sanatorium. Notice the Kellogg brothers call it a